Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Today, we're talking about the real estate numbers that matter with an Ivy League professor of real estate. Net operating income, debt coverage ratio, the time value of money, cash-on-cash return, and more, and what these numbers mean to you as an investor today on Get Rich Education. Countless property investors get killed with maintenance costs, but that's far less likely when you buy brand new construction. Let me tell you about JWB Real Estate Capital in Jacksonville, Florida. They pioneered the build-to-rent model where you can invest in new construction turnkey rental properties. That's why JWB was featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. To learn more and see inventory, go to newconstructionturnkey.com. Finally, Total Control Financial gives you checkbook control of your 401k and IRA money to invest in real estate. It's time to get your retirement money into your own checking account, but you've got to avoid the little-known tax that you'll pay with any self-directed IRA. Instead, it's time for the QRP. Learn more and get your free copy of the QRP book by text messaging QRP in all capital letters to 72,000.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, episode 256. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. Very few people, if any, have contributed to your understanding of real estate numbers, perhaps, than our guest today with his data analysis, his top-selling book, and later today he has a video course. You know, even if you're not a numbers person, the comforting thing that I can tell you about real estate investing is that all of the operations and the math are simple. Yes, it's either addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Pretty simple stuff. There are no exponents, trigonometry, or calculus involved here at all. So for you, it's really just a question of knowing what numbers to add up, subtract out, multiply by, or divide by. The operations are easy. Now, I'm a real estate investor, a geography guy, a student of economics, somewhat of a numbers guy, and maybe more abundantly minded than some. I'd say more good news for you and the numbers is that the more deals that you do, the more likely it is that you will absorb these figures because you're going to be applying them to your own property. You'll have texture that you can feel and a vested interest in how the numbers work. That's how it worked for me when I started out. Today's numbers that we discuss will probably apply more to apartments than they do with rental single-family homes. Remember that 5+ unit apartment buildings are largely valued on the net operating income and the cap rate, while 1 to 4 unit properties are valued more on comparable closed sales prices of nearby properties in the last 6 months or so. So let's get professorial as we talk real estate numbers. Today's guest is the author of the best-selling book, What Every Real Estate Investor Needs to Know About Cash Flow and 36 Other Key Financial Measures. It's really one of the best-known books in all of real estate. It's now in its 3rd edition. A graduate of Yale University, he's a professor of real estate development at Columbia University. Of course, that's the Ivy League school based in New York City. He's been involved in real estate for more than 40 years and is the founder and president of a real estate software firm as well. It's been 3.5 years since he was last here with us. Welcome back to Get Rich Education, Frank Gallinelli.
Well, thank you for having me back.
Frank's book that I mentioned, What Every Real Estate Investor Needs to Know About Cash Flow and 36 Other Key Financial Measures, is a book that I think is so important, and it approaches all the numbers that you would need to know, that it is on our recommended reading list. And there are only about 9 or 10 books on that list that you can find at getricheducation.com/read.
Keith, why do you have those other books on your list? I don't understand that.
Those 8 other books just aren't even in that class. They don't even belong. So
No, one's sufficient. Just this one covers it all. You're good. No problem.
Yeah, I was unfair in giving those other authors a chance. So, Frank, there are those 36 key financial measures as the title or subtitle of your book there. But which ones of those 36 measures really matter the most?
As you say, there are a lot, and some clearly, at least in my estimation, are critical. They are really key, if you will. And numbers matter. The numbers that we need to look at as investors, you might divide them up in 2 general categories. There is the one group that I would call the kind of the intrinsic numbers, the intrinsic to the property, where these really come out of your due diligence. This is where you've got to go take a look at the property and look at its income and expenses, verifying the rents and the operating expenses, checking the leases, that sort of thing. And the other part of that intrinsic, if you will, is intrinsic to the market. You've got to be looking at the things that are going on in the marketplace, because no investment property lives in a vacuum. And so if you're not familiar with what are comparable apartments or retail units or office units, what are they renting for? What are the prevailing cap rates? What are the occupancy rates? And so on. These are the kind of numbers that essentially are developed out of your due diligence. So those numbers matter. But then, of course, they're the numbers that you have to derive and project. That's kind of what I focus on in the various chapters of that book that you kindly included on your list, with what I'm sure is very good company. I think I'd probably narrow it down to 8 or 10 different metrics, if you will, or numbers that every investor really has to have a grip on in order to be able to invest successfully.
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about some of those. Like, for example, when we talk about those intrinsic numbers when you're doing part of your due diligence, a lot of it is coming up with that NOI, that property's net operating income. Tell us more about that.
What I invariably tell beginning investors, and even some who are not so beginning, is that what they should do is start with, it's been called in the industry ever since I was a little kid in short pants, called an APOD form, Annual Property Operating Data. And the purpose of that form really is to work your way down to the NOI, to the net operating income. That APOD form starts you off with the gross income. It asks you to take into account something that I find a lot of investors just kind of gloss over. They drive by it without looking, and that's the vacancy allowance, getting it down to a gross operating income, detailing out your operating expenses. So you finally get to the bottom line of the APOD, which is the net operating income. And it's important to, I think, for investors to understand that the net operating income is the net operating income. The reason I'm emphasizing that is because it includes the expenses that you need to account for to operate a property. And where sometimes people they run off the rails is including things in the NOI calculation that don't belong in the NOI calculation.
Right. It's certainly not a catch-all calculation, the NOI. I've described NOI, Frank, as your rent or other income minus VIMTUM. I don't know if you've ever heard that acronym, VIMTUM. It stands for vacancy, insurance, maintenance, taxes, utilities, and management. That's for a lot of those operating expenses in the net operating income, rent minus VIMTUM.
Those operating expenses, you can also think of those in terms of what do you have to pay on a kind of a day-to-day basis to run this property, to actually operate the property. And probably the item that most commonly inappropriately thrown in there is the debt service, the mortgage payments.
Right.
I would imagine 12 different ways in my book and my course and so on, is that you may need a mortgage to buy a property. You do not use a mortgage to operate a property. So that's not part of the cost of operating it.
And that throws some people off, that your biggest monthly recurring expense, the principal and interest, is not part of that net operating income.
Right, because it's just not. And there's a good reason for that. And that is because ultimately you're going to use that NOI for several different purposes, but probably chief among them is to apply a cap rate, a capitalization rate, to estimate the current market value. The reason why it's important that the debt service not be included in the NOI is that the value of the property should not be a function of what kind of financing you personally were able to get for this.
Exactly.
if you're a good credit risk and you can get a nice mortgage on this property, your debt service will be one thing. If I'm a deadbeat and I've got to pay, 19% for the mortgage on this property, which means I have a much higher debt service, well, why should my different debt service from yours affect the value, the market value of the property?
Exactly.
The market value should be independent of these considerations.
Very well said, because you and your creditworthiness are different. And we're talking about net operating income, the operating, those being those internal operations of the building as being separate from the borrower's creditworthiness. I think the way that I say it that has made some people understand that principal and interest is not part of NOI or cap rate is that you were the one that brought a mortgage to the building. The building didn't have one until you came along and brought that mortgage to the building. And if you sell that building and a new buyer comes along, well, now the NOI and cap rate are going to be the same, but your cash on cash return, something that includes the financing, is probably going to be different because that financing changed. So just because of an individual borrower's situation is different, that should not change the NOI or the way that property operates.
So the NOI, as we've been saying here, is used to estimate the current market value of the property. So that's a key use for that one piece of information, that one metric. When we talk about, which of the numbers matter, clearly the NOI is, at least on my list, it goes pretty close to the top of the numbers that you have to know about a given property, because it's not only going to be used to apply a cap rate for current market value. And by the way, I want to come back to that notion of current market value if we get a chance in a moment. But it's also going to be applied to something else, which is a metric that an awful lot of investors don't pay attention to. And that's the debt coverage ratio.
Yeah.
NOI is a number that you're looking at before you're subtracting out your debt service, your mortgage payments. Once you do subtract out your debt service, you're going to come to another really important number, which is cash flow. Get to that one also in a minute. But debt coverage ratio is really very important. It gives you a notion of what is the ratio of your NOI to your debt service. And this kicks in terms of vital metrics in a couple of different ways. For one thing, it has to do with the likelihood of you actually getting financing on this property, assuming you haven't bought this thing yet. You're looking at your NOI and you're looking at amount of debt service you're going to have to pay. So let's just focus on 1 year, on the first year of this property. The ratio of those two things is the metric called debt coverage ratio. So if your NOI is greater than your debt service, obviously that ratio must be, in that case, greater than 1. Every lender on the planet is expecting that they're going to loan you money only if your debt coverage ratio is greater than 1. In other words, if you have more than enough net operating income, expected net operating income, than you need to pay your mortgage debt.
Now, oftentimes I've seen where I have been in qualification for a property and putting a new apartment building in my portfolio. And one of the stipulations from the lender is that your DCR, debt coverage ratio, or sometimes I even see DSCR, debt service coverage ratio, needs to be at least 1.2 or 1.25, meaning that net operating income is at least 20 to 25% greater than the mortgage servicing cost.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. 1.2 used to be the standard until the great meltdown of 2008.
Right.
And then from that point on, 1.25 became essentially the standard. I think during the meltdown itself, it didn't really matter what the number was because you still couldn't get any money anywhere. But essentially, I think 1.25 now is more common as a reaction to some of the problems that occurred in 2008. What that means is that you have to be able to show that you're going to have 25% more net operating income than you really need. And I've always said that from the lender's point of view, they always kind of take the attitude that you're more likely to have unexpected expenses than you are to have unexpected income. So you better have a lot of wiggle room in there, because even at 25%, maybe your NOI isn't really going to be as high as you're expecting it to be because something unexpected happens. And if something unexpected happens, as I said, it's not likely to increase your NOI. It's more likely to decrease your NOI. So the lender wants to have that amount of wiggle room. And it's important for investors to be doing this calculation as early in the process as they possibly can. And I would say for at least two reasons. Number one, for your own benefit, because if what you're looking at is a debt coverage ratio that suggests that maybe your wiggle room isn't as big as it ought to be, well, that should be a red flag to you that at some point, instead of this property supporting you, you may have to be supporting this property.
That's right.
And that's not why you buy an investment.
That's a great point. Some people might calculate a projection on their property. By the way, for the listener's benefit here, we're typically talking about 5+ unit properties now where you have this debt service coverage ratio that you need. If you're calculating a debt service coverage ratio and it's only 1.1, you shouldn't just be thinking to yourself, oh, well, maybe I can't qualify. You ought to be thinking, maybe it's not worth it.
Yeah, exactly. And you just mentioned my second reason. Thank you. You won't qualify. Yeah. So if you haven't done this calculation and you walk into a lender and they look at this and they say, we're not giving you that loan. The real bottom line advice about doing this calculation is don't walk into the bank. If you have calculated this and the debt coverage ratio doesn't meet their underwriting requirements, you're not getting the loan. By going in there and asking for it, all you're doing is potentially damaging your own reputation for the next time you walk in there, which is really not a good idea. If you can't demonstrate to the lender that you have credibility as a potential investor, then you shouldn't be making this request for financing. You should be finding a way to debt coverage ratio to where it belongs so that it will support the financing. If that means that you have to be looking at whether or not some of these expenses are realistic, whether or not you can propose that these rents are under market and that they're going to be higher, but you shouldn't be going into the bank proposing financing on a property that clearly they're not going to approve. That's why debt coverage ratio is so important. And yet, amazingly, I find when I speak to beginning investors on forums and whatnot, it's almost as if they've never heard of this metric before. Kind of the same thing with the loan to value ratio, which is another important metric to understand. And the name pretty much implies what it is. But if a lender is going to loan 75% of the value of the property, it's going to be the lesser of the appraised value or the contract price. You have to recognize that if that appraisal comes in less than you're expecting it to be, you're going to have to come up with additional cash. And also to be realistic that if the appraisal comes in at higher than your contract price, you're not going to get 75% of that higher appraisal. You're going to get 75% of the contract price. Understanding how loan to value ratio is not only important once again for how you approach these investments, but it's also kind of conveys to the lender whether you really understand what you're talking about here.
Now, you had mentioned current market value, and I think some naive buyers might think that, well, whatever the asking price of this property is, that's probably a pretty good estimation of the current market value, but that is not the right way to approach current market value. That's just what the seller is asking for the property. And when we think of value, it comes back really again to net operating income. Value is net operating income divided by cap rate.
Yeah, the asking price is almost an irrelevancy.
It can almost be dismissed.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, when I teach income property analysis at my grad course at Columbia, I typically give my students 3 case studies. They actually do a 4th, which they have to make their own case study. But in the 3 case studies that I give them, I typically don't give them what the seller's asking price is, because what I want them to do is to look at the numbers to say what seems to be a reasonable price to offer on this property.
Right.
Current market value can be a little bit of a curveball also when you're doing it, when you're using it to make a decision as to the quality of the investment to you as a particular investor. Let me try to elaborate on what I mean by that. Capitalizing the net operating income is the standard procedure, I believe, used by the typical commercial appraiser to come up with a value at a point in time. As an investor, however, one of the things that you should have fairly high in your awareness, if you will, is that you're not buying this property just to have it at a point in time. The current market value that you get by capitalizing that operating income is what the appraiser tells you this ought to sell for, given the activity, the comparable sales, if you will, comparable rates of return that other investors are achieving for this type of property in this location.
And that cap rate is really only a snapshot.
Exactly, Keith. And the reason that that's so important is that what you're looking at as an investor is a holding period. Now, some people buy an investment with the idea that they're going to hold it for a very short time, in which case this capitalized net operating income it can inform their decision very well. But let's say that you're looking at a 5, 7, 10-year holding period. And this is a property that has leases in place and so on. If you start doing a longer-term view, what I'd call a pro forma analysis, where you project out the income and expenses realistically and reasonably over time. And this can be done, I think, most effectively where you have commercial leases where they may be prescribing the rents out over 3, 5, 7, 10 years. But if you do it out over time and do a discounted cash flow analysis of that property, that's going to tell you a whole lot more, because what it's going to be looking at with that discounted cash flow analysis is another metric that we haven't talked about yet, internal rate of return.
Internal rate of return, more of a catch-all, nearly an all-encompassing holy grail type of rate of return from real estate.
Yeah, and the reason it is the one metric that essentially combines both the timing and the magnitude of all of your future cash flows, including your disposition of the property, the big cash flow that you're hoping for at the end when you sell it. So timing really makes a whole lot of difference. I've given an example in one of my classes about a value add kind of proposition where somebody acquires a property, does some significant improvements to it, is able to raise the rents substantially in a short amount of time. And now with those new improvements in place, as time goes on, they can continue to raise the rents at a more modest pace, keeping in line with and in step with the rate of increase that other properties might experience. So you get a big jolt, if you will, a big bump based on the improvements that you make early, and then you have a slower growth, but still growth going forward. What the students are usually surprised, actually almost mystified by, is the fact that the IRR after that big bump occurs. If you look at the IRR for, let's say that bump occurs in the by the second year, and then you have smaller increases in NOI going forward. The IRR after that big bump, the IRR, if you have a 3-year holding period, it's lower. A 4-year holding period, it's even lower. 5-year holding period's lower still. And so why should the IRR be going down instead of up when everything else is going up? My rents are going up. My cash flow is going up. My net operating income are all going up, and my IRR is going down.
It's probably because you have more equity building up in the property.
That's part of it. But the real cause is that subsequent increases in NOI are actually diluting the overall return. You had a big bump early. So IRR pays attention to the timing as well as to the magnitude. If you get a big bump early, if you can't have that big a bump every year.
And why did you have a big bump early?
Because you did improvements to the property, raised the rents.
Okay.
Or maybe you just bought it where the rents were below market and raised the rents. But you had a substantial change in the NOI early on.
Okay. That's because you made improvements to the property early on.
And you can make substantial increases in rent. So you get a big bump early on, and then you have smaller bumps going forward. Well, the longer you hold it, the smaller bumps kind of dilute the overall increase in the value of the property. So the longer the holding period, the lower the internal rate of return. The message, of course, that comes through from that is that if you're going to do this sort of thing, maybe what you want to do is to look to resell not too long after you've made these big improvements. And the improvements, as I say, could be not just physical improvements. Maybe you bought the property based on rents that were below market. And you said, okay, I can go in now and, I may have to lose all my current tenants, but I can bring these apartments up to their current market, which could be substantially higher. I did that once in my distant and misspent youth. Rents were about 50% of market, but I bought it based on those rents. Lost all my tenants, of course, as soon as I raised the rents, but within a year or two, I was able to sell the property for twice what we paid for.
Yeah, that's terrific. I have an example of how I improved the NOI on a building. I have this 1977 apartment building, and it's in Alaska where the temperatures get really cold. So shortly after purchasing the building, The big improvement that I made is I replaced the old boiler. There was this old original boiler installed with the building in 1977, this big, ugly blue thing where whenever it would fire up, there would be these very big flames inside it. It looked like it weighed a ton. And I went ahead and replaced that with a newer, more energy efficient system. That cost me $20,000 to make that improvement. But it improved my NOI and it improved my cash flow by $400 a month. I didn't raise the rents at all, but it's because I was paying less in natural gas heating bills by $400 a month, which is $4,800 annualized. So a $4,800 NOI increase divided by just say a 0.07, because it was a 7 cap rate, increased the value of that building $68,000, even though I had only paid $20,000 for it. So to me, that was a pretty good investment. Any particular thoughts on that? And then would that get diluted over time with the IRR calculation?
You're making an excellent point. The IRR is not just about the revenue side of the equation. The IRR is also about the expense side of the equation. Now, you don't want to increase your NOI by cutting down on your maintenance costs and letting the property, you run into disrepair.
Right.
But if you can make smart decisions and smart improvements that can reduce your operating expenses, then that just as effectively will increase the NOI. If you have less money that you have to pay out of pocket, that leaves more in your pocket for the NOI, and that increases value.
And had I tried to raise the rents, I might have lost tenants, but I can capture NOI by reducing my expenses with a more energy efficient system. And the tenants might not even know it. Again, we're talking about NOI operations, the internal operations of that property.
As a matter of fact, just as a side note here, on my online video course, just yesterday, we finished uploading a section on value add investments, value add improvements. And we're talking about just exactly the kind of thing that you were just mentioning, how you could, as well as increasing the revenue side of the NOI equation, you could decrease the operating expense side. An example that I gave there, something that we used ourselves just recently, is that in a lot of places, for very, very little money, your utility company will come out and do an energy audit. And as part of that energy audit, may very well seal up every crack in the building, find places to add insulation for you, replace all the bulbs that might be in the common areas with LED bulbs, saving electricity. We did that recently on a property that I own. It cost us very little. Even on the heating system, they found ways of sealing up leaks that were occurring in the ductwork. So for very minimal cost, we were able to recover or reduce expenses, which increases the NOI and adds value to the property. So yeah, that's the other side of the NOI equation, is not one to be ignored.
And once you understand how the numbers better work, you're more motivated and incentivized to make improvements as an investor. I want to come back and talk more about discounted cash flows. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Frank Gallinelli. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold.
Would you like to know the easiest way to create wealth and passive income with real estate? This is Marco Santarelli with Norada Real Estate Investments. Now you can access the best deals without the stress or hassle of having to find, renovate, or manage those properties. We save you time by providing you with passive income investment properties in some of the best U.S. markets. Learn more by downloading your free copy of The Ultimate Guide to Passive Real Estate Investing. There's no obligation and nothing to buy. Simply visit passiverealestateguide.com and get your free copy today. That's passiverealestateguide.com.
For a real estate investor like you seeking an income property loan, go to Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. Over the years, you've heard President Chaley Ridge generously devote her time to you here on the show as a guest. Ridge provides investment property loans in most U.S. states, and you're going to find out how they've helped more people realize their dreams of real estate financial freedom than any other mortgage lender in the entire nation when you get started at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is the Real Wealth Network's Kathy Fettke, and you are listening to the always valuable Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Frank Gallinelli, the author of one of the best-selling real estate books I know of, What Every Real Estate Investor Needs to Know About Cash Flow and 36 Other Key Financial Measures. Frank, one of those measures is the internal rate of return, something that's quoted pretty often, but I think is highly misunderstood because an awful lot goes into the IRR calculation. And one of those components is the discounted cash flow. So you give an example in your book of you, the investor, say you go out and purchase a building today, you operate it for 5 years, and then you resell it. And just say, for sake of simplicity, your actual cash flows in year 1 are $1,000. Year 2 is $1,000. Year 3 is $1,000. Year 4 is $1,000. And year 5, your cash flow is again $1,000. Plus then at the end of 5 years, you have $20,000 in net sale proceeds. But here's what the discounted cash flow takes into consideration. You believe you should discount your cash flows by about 11%. And what this really means is that if you think you had this $25,000 in hand today, the $5K from the cash flows and the $20K from when you sell it in 5 years, if you instead had that in your hand today, you could invest it for an average return of 11% per year for the next 5 years. So it considers your opportunity cost by not having those cash flows today. So therefore, that adjusted value of each cash flow in year 1 would not be $1,000. It would be 11% less than $1,000. So for example, in year 1, your discounted cash flow would be $901. In year 2, it would be $812. In year 3, it would be $731, and so on. So that's a behind the scenes number, the discounted cash flows, which is just part of the internal rate of return. And a lot of people aren't thinking about that.
Absolutely right, Keith. The logic behind there is the time value of money.
Yeah.
That the dollar that you have to wait for is less valuable than a dollar you have in your hand right now, because since you don't have it in your hand right now, you can't reinvest it and earn more money with it. So if I have to wait 5 years to get the sale of the proceeds from the sale of the property, well, it's worth to me today less than the face amount of those proceeds because I don't have them today. If I did, I could have reinvested them. So time value of money is probably as important to investing of any kind, whether it's real estate or anything else. It's as important as anything you could be thinking about, because the waiting for the cash flows means that both the timing and the magnitude of the cash flows is something that IRR will take into account. Now, in the example that you just gave, what I had presumed in the example that I was using there in the book is that I knew how much I could reinvest those cash flows at. And so that was my discount rate. So I had a series of cash flows. I had a discount rate, and I used that to calculate what I thought was the present value, the present worth of that entire stream of cash flows. That's the present value calculation. What the IRR does is a very simple switcheroo with that same group of information. You still got that same series of cash flows. But now, the only thing that's different about it is that instead of calculating what that series of cash flows is worth based on what you think you could reinvest it at, now we say, I know what the future cash flows are worth. They're worth whatever I pay to get them. Now do a calculation to tell me what discount rate would I have had to make all those future cash flows equal to what I paid for them. That's all the IRR is. It's a lot simpler than most people think. It's simply changing the unknown in that time value of money calculation. In the one that you just defined there, I look at those future cash flows and I discount them, but what I think is the right rate at which to reinvest them. With the IRR, I say, okay, I'm going to buy that series of cash flows. I'm going to buy this property. I'm going to use, let's say, for sake of argument, I'm going to use $100,000 in cash to buy these future cash flows. If I use $100,000 in cash, that's the present value.
Right.
Those are the future cash flows. What rate of return, what discount rate would I have had to use to describe that situation? And that discount rate now, the interesting thing about it with internal rate of return is that it takes into account the timing as well as the dollar amounts, so that if the longer I have to wait, the lower the internal rate of return may be. If I have a big cash flow for some reason that occurs in the middle of that stream, well, maybe that pushes up the internal rate of return. But it looks at the timing as well as the actual dollar amounts. And all you're doing is taking the standard time value of money logic, saying, okay, I have a stream of cash flows. I have a rate at which I'm going to discount them. So what is that stream of cash flows worth at that discount rate? All it does is it changes the unknown. It says, Okay, all I'm going to do now instead is I'm going to just calculate what the discount rate should have been. That's IRR.
It's very difficult to future-proof investments. No one can do that exactly, but the discounted cash flow calculations as part of the IRR helps you do that. I talk about inflation on this show a fair bit, so our audience is pretty cognizant of inflation. For example, they would certainly understand that they would rather have $1,000 today because at 4% inflation, a year from now, that $1,000 is only going to be worth $960. But what we're talking about here helps bring in that opportunity cost, what you could have done as an investor, but you're missing out on. Just take that into consideration. One of the more popular real estate investing metrics out there, Frank, is one that I really don't like very much. I just don't think it's that useful. That is the GRM, the gross rent multiplier. And that is the price of a real estate investment divided by its gross annual income. That answer is your gross rent multiplier. For example, if you have a $1 million property and it provides $200,000 in gross annual rent, well, the GRM is $5 million divided by 200K. But if you have $1 million property divided by 250K of annual rent, which is better, well, now you're down to a 4 GRM. And no one really talks this way. No one goes around talking like, oh, well, I think I can do better than a 5 GRM. I'm going to go out and find a 4 GRM. The lower the number, the better. And to me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. What I prefer, which is really a lot like the GRM, but the calculation is just flipped over, is the rent to value ratio. I often talk in terms of your monthly rent expressed as a percent of the purchase price. For example, if you have $800 of rent income on a $100,000 single family home, that's a 0.8, which is very easily recognized is not as good as a 0.9 if you're getting $900 rent on a $100,000 single family home. So my point is, I don't find the GRM that intuitive. I prefer the rent to value ratio. What are your thoughts?
GRM, goes back quite a ways. I think, it's one of these things that was very popular in the 1970s, but not before or since. I believe it is still used on the appraisal form for 2 to 4 family houses. And that's about the only place I can recall ever seeing it. I think the only reason it might possibly have any usefulness there is that if you have a neighborhood of 2 to 4 family houses, there's a pretty good chance that they are similar in size and design and age, so that you're essentially factoring out all the differences. And so that the gross rent may be the only thing that distinguishes one property from another. And so maybe it works. That's the closest thing that I can give to a rationale for why you might want to use it. It's like a lot of metrics that I think have peculiarly limited usefulness. If I can add one to the favorites list here, the unfavorites list, I always get a lot of flack for this, but I'm not a big fan of cash on cash return.
That's interesting. That seems like a useful measure. So tell me about why you don't care for it as much as others.
Well, because I think it's useful only if you look at the cash on cash return for the first year of ownership.
Right.
Because once it gets out beyond the first year, you've lost the time value of money because the cash came out on day one. That's the cash invested. The cash flows, well, if they come out in year one, that's pretty close in time. So that's not going to be affected too seriously by the time value of money. But if I take the cash on cash return of a property and I look at it in year 4 or 5 or 6, well, I'm looking at a cash flow for which I have made no adjustment for the opportunity cost. And I'm comparing it to cash that came out of my pocket today. And those things are kind of apples and oranges. So if it does work for year one, that's fine. But there again, are you really going to hold your property for only 1 year? If you are, then the cash on cash return, I think, would be a useful metric. But if you're not going to hold it for just a year, if this is a long-term hold, then I don't see what kind of information you're really getting by looking at that. This is where I think if you're looking at the long-term hold, you want to take the internal rate of return, which adjusts for the timing and the size of the cash flows at the same time.
I've often thought of cash on cash return is really just a 1-year calculation. Cash on cash return being your annual cash flow divided by your skin in the game, which is your down payment and closing costs. And after 1 year, the cash on cash return transforms into the ROE, the return on equity, which is your annual cash flow divided by your equity. And that's the calculation that you would use from year 2 on. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree with you. My version of the return on equity is to take a look at the presumed equity you have in the property, not just the amount of money that you invested on day one as the metric. And the interesting thing about that measurement is that if you keep your eye on it, it can very often reveal a good time to sell the property, because what happens is as you pay down your mortgage, as your mortgage becomes seasoned, to use the term of art, your equity may grow faster than the growth in your cash flow.
Absolutely.
And so what happens is, while everything else is going up, you're in year now 10 or 12 of owning this property, and you do this calculation that uses equity, meaning your presumed equity, the difference between the selling price that would be at that time and the amount that you owe on it. You can see that return on equity going down while everything else is going up. And really what that's telling you is that you've got too much equity in the property.
Yeah, that tells you when you should sell or refinance. That ROE, that return on equity, cash flow divided by equity, is a great indicator. And I don't want to confuse my listeners, because often I talk about how the return from equity is always zero. Don't confuse that with the return on equity, which is that calculation, cash flow divided by equity. And that's because the addition and the infusion of additional equity does not help your rate of return. The value of a property is going to go up or down completely independent of how much equity you have in the property.
Exactly.
Frank, you do a great job of keeping people mindful of the numbers, but beyond that, these numbers are some great content. You need to pass this through the lens of context and think bigger and don't get too lost in the numbers. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this is something really that my thinking on this kind of evolved based on my interaction with my grad students and some of the cases I made for them to evaluate. And in terms of context, what I would tell them at the beginning of teaching my course would be that this was going to be the closest thing to a class in literature or fine arts that they were going to have in their financial curriculum, because I was going to teach them to look at, you can read a Shakespearean sonnet and you can read the words and you know what they say, but what did they really mean behind the words? Or you can look at a painting and say, but what's the story behind that painting? And so I would start to get them to think about not just getting themselves, wrapped up and wrestling with all those digits, all those numbers. I would give them case studies to work with, where they would have, a lot of information about the leases and the, tenant improvements and the commission expenses and so on and so forth. But I would always encourage them to look for the story behind the story. If I can share kind of an interesting, at least what I think is an interesting phenomenon that occurred in one of my cases, I would purposely give them a lot of detailed information about a mixed-use property with commercial tenants on the ground floor. And one of the commercial tenants, and I varied from time to time, one of the commercial tenants, I think if you read between the lines, this commercial tenant had a rather dicey business future. And one time I made it a locally owned bookshop. Another time I made it a restaurant where I went there just before closing the deal and discovered that they had terrible food and even worse service. And so they were obviously not destined to last very long. And the interesting thing, I would have an auditorium with, well over 100 students, and we'd be discussing each of these cases. And it seemed like every year it was one student who would put up his or her hand when we were discussing this case, and the other students were telling how much they think they should buy the property, for how much they think they should buy the property based on all the numbers that I gave them in the projection they were making. So, and one student would put up his or her hand and say, you know what? This whole case is a lot of baloney. I don't care what numbers you just gave us. Fact is, that tenant is going to disappear on us in the middle of the night in about 2 years at the most. And we're going to wake up one morning and we're going to have zero income from that unit. We're going to have a commission expense. We're going to have vacancy. We're going to have tenant improvement costs. And the whole thing has to be redone. Pro forma projections have to be redone based on that worst case scenario. And fortunately, someone must have been listening to the class when I told them you should always do best case, worst case, and somewhere in between. This student, different person every year, obviously, but seemed to be always only one student who would pick up on the fact that you had to put things in context. You could get so wrapped up in the numbers that you could overlook the obvious, kind of the real life story that was lurking behind these numbers. So I actually made it a point after a while of giving a lecture on looking at the numbers behind the numbers. And I think that's very important because we can do a really, really good job. We got a lot of tools. I've got a software company that's, 35, 38 years. that's devoted to running the numbers. But sometimes you got to say to yourself, are these really going to be the right numbers? Or could there possibly be another set of numbers that I need to take into account before I make my decision about this property?
That's so important to say. The numbers matter. The numbers are the content, but everything else around it paints this picture, this art, if you will, like you mentioned, of context. For example, you might run the numbers, get all excited about a 12 cap on a property, but then realize that the neighborhood's so bad you wouldn't feel safe driving through there in the daytime, and there's no way you're actually going to collect the rent from those tenants. Or, for example, you might get a high-flying cash-on-cash return or cap rate, and then you realize, oh, well, all these tenants are signed to 3-month leases, and that's why the rents are inflated, which is going to be a lot different than if all those tenants had signed 3-year leases, even though it's the same rent amount. And it really comes back to what I like to often say, that in real estate, the market is more important than the property.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And there's a bit of due diligence that I have found is very often lacking. I tell beginning investors, you've really got to do your due diligence about the market, not just the property, because the market is going to have an enormous impact on the nature of your projections. As I said right at the beginning of our discussion, no property lives in a vacuum.
Absolutely. So you've got the book that has a lot of numbers in it, but there are also enough stories and a little bit of humor in your book, so one doesn't just get completely bored and lost in the numbers. But you've also helped bring things to life with a video course. Tell us about that before you go.
More and more over the years, I've found myself kind of attracted to the idea of teaching this material. I think it probably evolved from somewhere in the middle of our history as a software company, where we would talk to folks and realize that if people were going to use our software effectively, they really had to understand the nature of the analyses that they were doing. And so that got me to writing articles. Articles got me invited to write some books. Then the teaching at Columbia. After enough trips on Metro North from here in Connecticut into the city, I decided, I could be teaching this stuff as an online video course just as effectively, I would hope, as I do after I get off that train. So I began to develop this online video course where I actually cover a lot of the topics that I cover in my grad course, but also some topics that I don't cover there, where I will deal with development projects, rehab projects, with partnerships, with, as I mentioned, value add and that sort of stuff, but also going through really, if you will, kind of the bumper to bumper financial analysis, where we're looking at time value of money, where we're looking at the pro forma projections and how to do a discounted cash flow analysis and how to understand all of the key metrics. So I've had a lot of fun doing that. It is a video course. Fortunately, you don't have to look at my face. It's mostly the slides and the numbers on the screen, but you do get to listen to my dulcet tones. And it's proven to be fairly popular. We get a lot of positive feedback about it, and I have been increasing the content in it over the couple of years that we've developed it. So anybody who signs up for it automatically has access to any new content we add. One of the things that we found that people particularly seem to appreciate was case study examples, where I go through different property types and actually walk people through how to analyze these different property types and how to interpret the analyses. So you have some understanding, some practical understanding, as well as, if you will, the academic understanding of how these things work. So you can get the course at learn.realdata.com. What I'd like to do is to offer listeners a 30% discount on the course if they come and pay us a visit in the next couple of weeks.
Well, thanks so much for that, Frank. Our listeners will really appreciate that. I have watched a number of the modules and case studies myself. Frank Gallinelli, thanks so much for coming back onto the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, yeah, just a great episode for your learning today with Professor Frank Gallinelli. If you want to check out his video course, which I found to be something that's very helpful for investors from beginner to advanced, as a Get Rich Education listener, you can use discount code SAVE30 when you enroll in the course there at, again, learn.realdata.com. That's where you get started. SAVE30 is the discount code. If you understand what we discussed today, because cap rate is net operating income divided by the price or the value, then in a sagging real estate market, like many places experienced 10 years ago, people couldn't get loans. That meant rents increased dramatically in relation to price, and therefore cap rates rose. In a booming market like many US and world metros are experiencing now, that's when rent increases lag behind the appreciation rate, and that's when cap rates sink. I love talking about the time value of money today. That's something that people don't think about very often, and it can have a more dramatic effect on your future returns than inflation can. If you want to master the numbers and learn about what we discussed today and way more, check out Frank's video course. Big thanks to Frank Gallinelli today. Again, he was generous enough to extend a 30% course discount just to Get Rich Education listeners like you in his video course. His course is called Introduction to Real Estate Analysis. It's not thousands of dollars either. It's quite a modestly priced course, even before the discount. When you enroll in the course there at, again, learn.realdata.com, that's where you get started. Use discount code SAVE30. Until next week, when I'll faithfully return to help you build your wealth, I'm Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.